Is it time for a mind shift? If you don't know what that means, then join your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Christian pastor and Bible college teacher of over 20 years, along the journey of deconstruction and reconstruction of faith, life, religion, and spirituality.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for listening in to this edition of Mindship Podcast. I am, as always, your host, Dr. Clint Haycock. I am really excited to be bringing you this episode this week. We're going to be talking to my good friend, psychotherapist Laura Anderson. In this episode today, we're going to be getting into the subject of RTS, Religious Trauma Syndrome. How we're going to get there is, but first we're going to talk about Laura's own personal story coming out of evangelicalism, how she deconstructed and walked away from it all. Then we're going to talk about trauma in general, and then work our way into specifically RTS, Religious Trauma Syndrome, and what you can do about it in terms of treatment, identifying it, what to do when you're triggered, and more. And the reason that I am so excited to bring you this chat with Laura today is that if you're like me, someone who survived growing up in a fundamentalist or high control religious group like I did, or maybe you were part of a cult, who knows, but religious trauma syndrome, it's a very real thing. Now, what is it? From what I understand in my study of it, the term religious trauma syndrome was coined by Dr. Marlene Winell. She's the author of the book Leaving the Fold, which has proved to be very helpful to a lot of people who've walked away from fundamentalism or high control religious groups or cults. I came across a really helpful article online by Dr. Marlene Winell just entitled Religious Trauma Syndrome, and she provides a really helpful overview of what RTS is. And she says, in response to the question, what is RTS? She says, quote, RTS, Religious Trauma Syndrome, is the condition experienced by people who are struggling with leaving an authoritarian, dogmatic religion and coping with the damage of indoctrination. They may be going through the shattering of a personally meaningful faith and or breaking away from a controlling community and lifestyle. The symptoms compare most easily with PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, which results from experiencing or being confronted with death or serious injury and causing feelings of terror, helplessness, or horror. She goes on to conclude and says, this can be a single event or chronic abuse of some kind. With RTS, there is chronic abuse, especially of children, plus the major trauma of leaving the fold. That's the group that you were a part of. Like PTSD, she says, the impact is long-lasting with intrusive thoughts, negative emotional states, impaired social functioning, and other problems, end quote. And there was something else I wanted to add. She also goes on to say, quote, with RTS, the trauma is twofold. First, the actual teachings and practices of a restrictive religion can be toxic and create lifelong mental damage. In many cases, the emotional and mental abuse is compounded by physical and sexual abuse due to the patriarchal, repressive nature of the environment. And she goes on to say, second, departing a religious fold adds enormous stress as an individual struggles with leaving what amounts to one world for another. This usually involves significant and sudden loss of social support while facing the task of reconstructing one's life. People leaving are often ill-prepared to deal with this, both because they have been sheltered and taught to fear the secular world, and because their personal skills for self-reliance and independent thinking are underdeveloped, end quote. And that is a good, helpful overview of RTS, Religious Trauma Syndrome, that we're going to be talking about with Laura Anderson in just a minute here. So if you are a survivor, if you're like myself and so many other people who come out of fundamentalist religion, cults, high control groups, groups with undue influence, you undoubtedly experienced religious trauma, and you may be dealing with it in terms of what Marlene Winell says. It's a post-traumatic stress disorder. It's something that can affect us many, many years later. And so let's go on into this discussion. This is a long one with Laura Anderson, but I guarantee it's going to be worth your time. So stay with us. Let me know what your thoughts and comments and feedback are. I'd love to hear how this episode has helped you, has impacted you in any way. Send me a DM on Twitter at Mindshift2018. You can also follow me there. And let me know how this episode has helped you. All right, here we go. Let's go on into exploring religious trauma syndrome with Laura Anderson. I'm so happy to be talking to Laura Anderson, psychotherapist, specialist in religious trauma syndrome. That's what we really want to get into. But first, I want to find out a little bit about you, Laura. Thank you so much for being a guest on Mindshift Podcast.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today.
Yeah, it's going to be great. I am so excited to get into this topic of, we're going to get, that's our kind of goal, is we're going to end up talking about religious trauma syndrome, trauma in general, and then I guess we're going to talk about how can you recover from RTS, religious trauma syndrome. But first, let's get into a little bit of your backstory. Can you kind of briefly tell us where did you come from? Were you born into evangelicalism, fundamentalism, the church? Where did you come from in terms of religious background?
Yeah, all the things. Yes,
all of it.
All of it. I grew up. I was born into a fundamentalist family. Grew up in the church. I grew up in the Evangelical Free Church, which used to be called the Dutch Reformed Church. So the way that I best describe it to people is it is a conglomeration of the theology and hellfire brimstone of Southern Baptists with the rigidity and rules of Church of Christ and the stoicism of Lutheranism.
Wow,
so,
what a mix.
Yeah, right, a nice mix. And then our church practiced Reformed theology, so Calvinism. So kind of this like marriage of a lot of toxicity is really how I grew up.
That is pretty traumatic. Yeah, it can be for sure.
It definitely,
especially Calvinism. I think I've talked to a lot of people who come out of a strong Reformed Calvinist background, and the problem with that is, well, one of the problems, of course, is that if you're not one of the elect, according to the theology, you're destined for hell.
Yeah.
And then the other problem I think too is that a lot of people struggle with, they think, okay, I'm a Christian, but am I actually one of the elect? Calvinism would say you can't lose your salvation if you're one of the elect, but how do you know if you're one of the elect? That could cause a lot of trauma.
Yeah.
And anxiety.
A huge amount of anxiety, because there's this idea, of course, of like, yes, I'm supposedly the elect, and so I'm good. But then you're supposed to, quote unquote, work out your salvation, which is, the sanctification process. And so that kind of can really add anxiety, because you're constantly going, well, am I doing enough of this or not enough of this, or following the rules enough? And I know for myself, like I struggled with anxiety on a daily basis, so much that I didn't know that was abnormal to have so much anxiety on a daily basis. And it wasn't until I gave up just even the label of Christian that the anxiety just disappeared, because all of a sudden I wasn't so worried about what I was doing or not doing or making mistakes. And I just had a completely different experience. I was like, whoa, what is this feeling in my body? Or rather the lack of feeling of anxiety in my body. So yeah, I lived with that for close to 30 years.
Yeah,
just
you were in deep.
Anxiety.
But yeah, I like what you said. You don't even notice that it's because it's your normal.
Yeah,
it's the new normal. It's so normalized, because I grew up in fundamentalism as well. Yeah. I grew up, and we've talked about this in other podcasts about, I grew up in the Bill Gothard teaching, and that was very dysfunctional, toxic theology as well. And as you say, I agonized as a kid over whether or not I was going to get left behind in the rapture and all. And I thought that was just normal. It was normal. All my friends were doing it too.
Yeah.
And not until you leave that you realize, what the hell?
Right.
It's so damaging.
It's so damaging. And it's funny, I've heard you talk about the Bill Gothard stuff. And, he did a series of like revivals around the United States. And he came to Minneapolis, which is where my parents met and lived and still live. And they got engaged after one of his revivals.
So, of course they did.
Right? So
even though he was single, he got them together.
Yeah.
Giving advice on marriage and family as a single man. Anyway.
Yep. They went to that. They had been dating and whatnot, but they went to that one night on a date and got engaged afterwards. So
your dad took your mom to a Bill Gothard seminar on a date. Wow. There's a lot better things that you could be doing with your time, but anyway, so
yeah.
so brought your parents together.
I guess it brought my parents together. That's
wow.
Good, I guess. Yeah.
That's a bit strange.
Yeah. So, I definitely can understand with the toxicity of that theology and growing up that way, because I can very much identify. Yeah.
So how did you get out then? Did you deconstruct sort of theologically? What was your journey out of that world?
Yeah. So I grew up at actually an evangelical free church camp. My dad was a director there, and I didn't realize until quite a long time afterwards that we technically were like missionaries, because we had to raise support and everything, which caused a lot of tension. You know, I had 3 other siblings, so a family of 6, and trying to raise a family of 6 on a missionary salary, very tight. Felt a lot of anxiety about that too, but grew up kind of having a very questioning, curiosity-driven spirit, but learned very early that questions were not acceptable. I was a very emotional and passionate child, and learned that that was not acceptable either. So learned that I really had to like stuff that down. And I had a lot of questions. I did not want to participate in church things. I did not like youth group. I didn't like doing missions trips. I didn't like going on retreats, but I would end up going because my parents would guilt trip me into it, or because I was, as much as I was trying to kind of get away from that, I also didn't want to be disappointing to my parents. And I felt weird that like I wasn't as passionate about this stuff that they were preaching was the way to go.
You should be.
Right? Yeah.
What's wrong with you, Laura?
I know. And that's what I believed as a kid. I'm like, my gosh,
Something's
like
wrong with me.
I don't want to go up to somebody's door and knock on it and ask if they knew Jesus or what would happen to them if they died tonight. Like that was not my idea of fun. And, but I thought, well, there must be something wrong with me then, because this is what we're supposed to do. And so I'd also heard a lot of testimonies of people that were like, oh, you know, I finally followed God after high school. That's when God really got a hold of my heart. And so I kind of just had this assumption that, you know, once I'm out of high school, I'll just follow God more. And it was interesting because I remember my high school graduation, walking out of our commencement ceremony and just having this like overwhelming feeling come over me of like, every decision that I make from this point forward could affect the rest of my life. So I have to make the right ones. And I can't date anybody because I can only date my future husband. You know, when I graduated, it was kind of like the purity culture was really coming into like making a not resurgence. So like a surgence. It was
a surgence. Is that a word? It is now.
We'll make it up. Yeah. There was a
make
surgence.
It up. It was surging. Yeah. It was important in the evangelical. It still is, isn't it?
Yeah. Exactly. And so, I mean, it was right around the time that Joshua Harris came out with I Kiss Dating Goodbye. And so, you know, like any 18, 19, 20-year-old who's trying to figure out who am I, there was a real safety in the purity culture. There was, you know, the step-by-step process. If you do these things, then this is what's going to happen. And that felt really safe for me. So as an adult, I quote unquote, chose to really dig into this. I know now that I don't think I actually chose to, because I had been so indoctrinated that I don't know that I had any choice but to do this. And so I got into church, like first with like volunteer ministry. I worked with middle school kids, which I did not want to do, but I had a pastor come to me and say, you know, God told me that you are supposed to be volunteering with us.
You're called to the church ministry.
Yeah. And so, you know, at 18 years old, I'm like, who am I to question God, right?
Absolutely.
You know, God's speaking through my pastor, and so I better listen.
Gotta be true.
Yeah. And so I did that, and I actually ended up getting hired to the church in a ministry assistant role, which was a great job for some things. I can plan a very large event with my hands tied behind my back and it'll go off smoothly. I'm thankful for that.
You learned some skills.
Yeah, I did learn some skills, but it was a very spiritually abusive situation. I remember A couple weeks into the job, well, probably a couple months into the job, the senior high youth pastor came and started accusing me of not doing some task that his assistant was supposed to do, and was making a ton of accusations, calling me a liar, telling me that I wasn't submitting to him, and was so loud that another kind of ministry assistant from a different department poked their head in, and instead of trying to diffuse the situation and said like, hey, like, let's take a break, they just closed the door so that it wouldn't be so loud for them.
So I can't hear the shouting as he's dressing you down for something it wasn't even your fault.
It wasn't my fault. I had no idea what was going on. And so I remember at the time thinking, oh, this is what they call church politics. And then I'm like, no, that's abuse,
That's
and
straight abuse.
And whenever this was happening, he was very clear. He said, you will not tell anybody about this. You for sure will not tell your boss, who is also this particular pastor was my boss's boss. And he said, and if you do, then you are not submitting to the leadership that God has put in place. And I was still a little bit rebellious enough that I was like, no, I'm going to call somebody.
This isn't right.
I talked to a family member, and then I did talk to my boss, who is the pastor. And both of them said, you need to make this right. You need to repent. You need to try to apologize. And in my mind, I was like, I have no idea what I'm apologizing for. I haven't done anything wrong. Yeah.
Why am I apologizing for getting screamed at by this guy?
And so I started to learn really quickly, this is not safe. I can't trust myself. I must have done something wrong. Here's these people that are in authority over me, and I have to submit to them. Because if I don't, I started to learn my job is at stake. And so that felt very frightening for me. So I always kind of held situations like that as realizing this does not feel right, but I also don't know. I'm a single young female. I don't know that I have much power to do anything in this situation. And so I continued to work there. What actually got me out of working there is there was a mutual interest between one of the other small group leaders and myself. I was probably 21 at the time, so I'm not that much older than the high school students at that point. And this small group leader happened to be a high school student. And we both were way invested in the purity culture. And so we said, okay, no appearance of evil. So we will not do anything until he graduates from high school. It was in 2 months from that point. And out of good faith, I said, I'm going to tell my pastor boss because I don't want anything to look weird. And he took that and got incredibly angry. He told the rest of the leadership, the elders, the pastors, and they came back to me and they said, well, you can't act on this. You're not allowed to act on this until after he graduates, which I'm like, yeah, I know.
That's what I said.
That's
We're not doing anything.
I came to you and said, this is what's
full disclosure.
Yeah.
You've got this relationship, but nothing's happened.
Yeah. So they watched me like a hawk for 2 months, which was fine. I didn't do anything. I had nothing to hide. And after he graduated, we decided we'll try dating, but quasi-courting. We never went out. We stayed at his house under the supervision of his mother. And somehow word got back to the leadership, and they were like, nope, we don't like this. This is wrong. This is bad. You are a manipulative person. You are not a submissive person. He can't lead you. So you're going to have to break up with him, at least until he goes to college. And I knew at that point I was not okay with it, but I also my job was being threatened again. And so I thought, well, I will tell them, fine, but I'm not going to completely break up with him. And so we just continued spending time at his house under the supervision of his mother. We never went out in public, anything like that. But by that point, the church was so upset with me that they were anybody that had any sort of relationship with me, they were starting to slowly turn against me, until all of my friends, all of the girls that I mentored, all of my small group leaders, and my family were reporting back to them, any interaction that they had. There was lies and accusations. They'd be like, oh, we saw her here and they were doing this. And it's like, no, you didn't, because those things never happened, or I've never been to that place before. We didn't kiss at all. He kissed me like on the forehead once, because you can't even kiss before you get married.
No, you can't.
And so, all these things, but rather than them ever coming to me, they just blew this out of proportion. And I think they knew by that point they couldn't fire me for that, but they could make it unbearable for me to work there. And they did that. And so after about almost a year of that behavior and treatment, I just reached my end point, and I thought, I need to go back to school. Like, I need to get out of here, and started applying to graduate programs and different churches down in the Minneapolis area, and had really great interviews, was really promising. And one by one, they just kept falling through. And I thought, well, this is really weird, to leave.
Why can't I land a job?
Yeah. And come to find out that they had made phone calls to all of them, the schools and the jobs, and blackballed me essentially, and basically trapped me. Like, I couldn't leave. I had nowhere to go. I was like 22 years old, 23 years old. I was almost 23 at that point. And I thought, oh my God, like I can't even leave if I wanted to.
You're literally trapped in this situation.
Yeah. And at that age, I've only ever been taught what to think. I've never been given critical thinking skills. And so even though in my body, I felt like, oh, this is not right. I had no idea how to get out. And at 22, 23, there's not a lot of resources either. My parents weren't going to help with something like that financially. And, if every job I applied for was being sabotaged, I wasn't even going to get a job. I had a degree in Christian ministry. Who's going to hire a female?
Can't be a pastor.
Can't be a pastor. So I was kind of at their mercy. And so I ended up landing a job at the local community college doing at college admissions. And I would travel around the state, and it was a really nice break because I would be gone during the week. I'd come back on the weekends and then leave that next Monday morning. And so I hated the job, but it seemed to give me space to kind of go, hey, what's going on? But at the same time, I was also trying to get back into the good graces of the church, because this was my community. This is all I had known. And so they set up this kind of like restoration plan, which of course included me giving tons of time and energy to the church and what they wanted. And so during that time, I secretly just started looking at and applying at graduate schools for therapy, and landed at Liberty University.
Oh, you went to Falwell University.
Yep, I did.
Are you sure you want to admit that?
I am sad to admit that. I actually took my diploma off my wall in my office because it just is such the bane of my existence.
A lot of people have mailed their diplomas back, haven't they, from Liberty?
I am waiting to do that. As soon as I get my PhD diploma, that thing is going
back. You can have it back. Yep.
Yeah. And so, but interestingly, Liberty was where I really started to deconstruct, because for the first time, I was being introduced to secular textbooks, to different ways of thinking, to, I quickly came to the conclusion like, oh, not all people are in a box or black and white, or there's more. And so I'm the hilarious part about being at Liberty is that they are the ones that fueled my journey to leave.
Which of course, they would have never, that's not their aim.
No.
Let's help people deconstruct and leave the faith.
Yes, exactly.
That's probably not part of the motto that's on the gates of the university
Definitely
as you
not.
drive in. Pretty
Definitely
sure that's not. Jerry Falwell is senior spinning in his grave right now. I'm sure he is.
I'm sure. So so that was really the start of it. And I made a decision about halfway through my master's degree. I thought I'm going to move. I'm now going to have the means to. I have a career that I can stand on my feet. And so about 3 months after I graduated, I moved to Nashville and started, with community mental health, and did that for about 18 months before I opened my own practice. And through that time, that's really when the kind of the deconstruction really started kind of a bigger role in my life because I was away from everything that I had grown up with. And even though I was still going to a Southern Baptist church, I finally had permission to start asking some questions that I'd been holding for decades at that point, and had a few people who weren't scared by questions and who could point things out and go, I don't really think that that's what it is, or I don't think that that's what God was meaning or whatnot. And the very first therapy session that I ever went to, my therapist was like, it's a little concerning that this is the belief. And I looked at him like, I have no idea that life would be different, and so that was frightening because I was like, oh my gosh, like I have to change all these things.
Yeah,
but
your whole worldview is messed up, isn't it now?
Yeah.
You got to reorient the whole thing. Once the house of cards starts to topple,
it just crumbles.
It all goes.
That's it. You flip over one stone and then you have to keep flipping over more stones the longer you go. And so I am ultimately grateful for that process and where it's gotten me. But I mean, it was a very scary few years as you're really you're literally pulling everything apart. And to be totally honest, like the thing that got me really kind of confident in, I don't think all this stuff that we've learned is really all it's cracked up to be, is in the purity culture. Like I had subscribed to this idea of you don't even kiss until you get married. And when I moved to Nashville, I had a friend who I loved very much who like challenged that a little bit. She was like, where did you find that in the Bible? Like, I don't think God cares about kissing. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. Let's talk about
explore this thing.
Explore this. And so I had changed kind of this view. And as I started dating somebody from one of the churches that I was at, I was kind of thinking like, oh, well, if kissing isn't wrong, like are these other things good, bad, wrong? Like what would this be? And so the first time I ever had any sexual experience, I went from like A to Y, not A to Z, but
right,
like
not the whole way. Pretty close, though.
Not really something I would actually recommend for your very first experience.
Right.
However, I remember waking up the next morning thinking, I don't want to get out of bed because I know that when my feet touch the ground, all the shame and guilt that I've been told for decades now that will wash over me it's going to like flood me.
It's going to be the walk of shame.
Yeah.
Literally.
And I was like, I don't know that I'm ready for that. And so
I'll
I just
stay in bed.
Stayed in bed until the last minute. It was a Sunday morning. And so I thought, okay, I got to get out of bed. And my feet hit the floor. And the only word that adequately describes how I felt is sunshine. And it was like the sun was like streaming in, and I felt so connected to myself or the universe or God, whoever that was, and people. And I thought, oh shit, I've done something wrong. Like I'm supposed to be convicted right now and I don't feel convicted.
Yeah, that's how lost you really are.
Yeah. Right. I thought, oh my God, like
should feel horrible.
My heart is so hard that God can't get to me. And
it's
so
amazing
I said, well,
how we interpret something like that, huh?
Yeah. So I thought, well,
feel bad.
I'll go to church. That's where I'll be convicted. And I was.
It's a Sunday morning after all.
So no conviction at church. And then that night with small groups, I thought, okay, that's when I'll be convicted. No conviction. And so for about 2 weeks, I begged God to convict me. And I was like, I'll never do this again if you don't want me to. I will go to the church leadership and confess my sins. Like I will do whatever I need to. Just make me feel guilty, God. And I was like, felt super anxious about that. And I remember speaking with one of my girlfriends who hadn't grown up in the church and was a little bit older than me. And I shared this experience and she said, well, do you feel like you've been honest with God and whatever? And I said, yeah, I do. And she goes, well, then maybe you don't create guilt where there isn't any. And I was like,
that's heavy.
Oh, shit. Yeah. Because in that moment, I knew that if that statement was true, then I had to check everything. Like everything was up for grabs. And I had to be willing to let go of every belief that I had ever had and do something different. But that felt less scary than staying in this fundamentalist belief system. And so I took the jump. I jumped off the cliff and I said, one more day of this is less scary than one day of the unknown, and I'm going after that.
And it's certainly a lot less damaging in terms of, the guilt, the shame, the anxiety, all the horrible things that we are burdened with. This idea of religious scrupulosity, that's a thing, isn't it? Where you're just everything, you have to check every thought, holding every thought captive to Christ. And we've got to check every motive, even like you said, the appearance.
Yes.
Avoid the appearance of evil. If you think in your heart that you've had sex with someone, it's just as much as if you've had the actual act. Those are the words of Jesus.
Yeah.
I mean, the damage that kind of thinking can cause is just unbelievable. So you didn't become a psychotherapist because of all the trauma in your past, but how does it relate to the current practice that you have, the clients that you see?
Yeah, so I specialize in complex trauma, and I consider religious trauma part of that. We can get more into that as to like why that is. But I have healed from my own trauma and then brought that into my therapeutic modalities and clients that I work with for the last, decade or so. So it is interesting that, I was afforded a lot of therapeutic tools that I thought, these will be great for my clients. And turns out I needed them first.
You needed them. I was going to say, because I remember taking an introduction to counseling class in Bible college.
Yeah.
And while it obviously had that sort of Christian paradigm, the basic model is you need to help people regress back to their past traumas, at which point God will fix them through the agency of the Holy Spirit. That was the model. But we went through family dynamics, and that I can remember sitting in class, it just blew my mind, because I'm thinking, these are tools that I'm supposed to be learning as a pastor to help others, and yet I'd never really studied family dynamics. I'd never studied childhood trauma. That was the first step, I guess, years and years ago. That was over 20-some years ago now, where my eyes were, like you said, started to be open to, whoa, and I'm seeing how it's affecting the way I'm acting as an adult. And I can link it back to specific things that happened in my childhood and in my family. And it explained so much, you know? And so I can resonate with what you're saying.
Well, and I'm a big believer too, and I teach this to my supervisees that are in the process of licensure, is that as a therapist, I can never take my client further than I've gone myself. And so if I'm not willing to go to the deep, dark, secret places of my own life, I'm never going to be able to take a client there because I'm not comfortable going there myself. So when I do my own work and I can go to those yucky places and I can understand and feel and process the emotions, I gain a greater capacity then to be able to sit with people in those spaces and hold like a safe container for them to go through the yuck and to be there to support them. And so my own process through not just religious trauma, but some other trauma as well, has allowed me to be a much better therapist, because I sit in yuck all day long and it doesn't feel that uncomfortable. I can
been
go
there, done that.
Yeah, it's not scary anymore.
Well,
so I appreciate
go ahead.
that. No, I was just gonna say, so I really appreciate the journey that I've been on because of that.
Yeah, it's hugely important. I think you're absolutely right. You can't take someone there where you haven't sort of been yourself, or at least are willing to go.
Absolutely. Yep.
I wonder if we can work our way toward this issue of religious trauma. What about trauma in general? Because, I mean, all of us have experienced traumas, loss of a loved one, a terrible accident, an illness, something like that, some disappointment. We have to go through trauma. What is it about trauma in general? What does it do to people psychologically, even physically, perhaps? And then how does that relate to religious trauma?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things that I like to differentiate first is understanding that trauma is not the thing that happened. So trauma is not the car accident. It is not actually the religion. It's not the abuse. It's not the rape. It's not the death. Trauma is the way that our body, it's the response to the event that happened. It's the way that our nervous system responds to that threatening or overwhelming event. So the way that I say it, the kind of like the most succinctly, is that trauma is not the thing that happens to us, but that trauma is our response, our nervous system response that has to do with the thing that happened to us. Does that make sense? Because I want to make sure we're kind of coming from the same.
So you're saying it's like a physiological thing. It's not just the actual raw event that happened. It's the way it's because I think maybe a lot of people would think it's purely psychological.
Yeah.
Like you say, something horrible happens to us and mentally it's going to affect us. But what effect does that have on us physically and psychologically as well?
Yeah. So all of us are unique individuals. And so trauma is unique too. So our bodies, our nervous systems all respond differently to different things. So I think an easy example, and we may have talked about this before, is let's say that you and a friend are walking down the street and you witness a really horrible car accident. How you respond, how your body responds to that may be very different than how your friend's body responds to that, even though you're witnessing the exact same thing. So that friend may be able to go, oh man, that really sucks. Actually, let me help or whatever. But you might freeze and go, shit, my legs won't move at all. Like, I know I want to help, but like my body is frozen in this moment. And that's not a conscious choice that you made. It's not a conscious choice that they made. It's how their body's nervous system received that event that happened and then acts accordingly. Does that help make a little bit more sense? So it is a physiological.
Yeah, I was going to say, we were talking about this the other day, and this idea of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yes.
And I think the classic kind of example would be sort of the Vietnam veteran, the person who goes through traumatic combat and sees their buddies dying and horrific things that they witness. They go home back to the civilian life. It could be 10, 20 years later, they hear a helicopter fly overhead, and bam, they're triggered. And all this stuff that they've sort of walled off maybe has come flooding in, and they're struggling, they're debilitated. I mean, is it actually a physiological thing, something like an example like PTSD in a combat veteran?
Yeah. So when our body responds to whatever this overwhelming event, it stores it in the body. And that's where we see those responses like fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And so that traumatic energy is stored in the body, and it's constantly looking for a way to kind of, we call it in clinical terms, like complete the trauma cycle. Resolve it. So maybe that's being able to get that energy out through a fight response, or through talking, or through running, or through crying or emoting. And if we don't have the opportunity in that moment or the moments afterwards with like a safe, connected person where our body starts to feel safe and we can process that, it just lives inside our body. And that can sometimes get shut down for, like you said, 10, 20 years. And then all of a sudden this very random, unrelated thing happens, and now we are back in the bunker, trying to keep ourselves and everybody else alive. And we don't consciously get to choose that we're back in that moment, but our body goes back there because it never was able to process that traumatic energy in that moment, that it was so overwhelming that your body kind of just went into shutdown mode. So the thing is that when we aren't able to process trauma energy at the time of the event, it does live inside our body, and it can affect us physiologically, psychologically, mentally, relationally, sexually, spiritually, all of these sorts of things.
So many ways.
Think
about the classic, I'm a big World War I history fan. Yeah. And that was a lot of it, as I understand, in terms of modern psychology, was when the victims of shell shock is what they called it then, where their bodies and their whole system would literally just shut down. Yeah. And they'd be quivering underneath their beds in the hospital and just completely overwhelmed. Yeah. And they just couldn't handle anything.
Mhm.
And that's, I think, from what I understand about it, that's when they first started investigating what is this is a physiological thing as well as a psychological thing. They're in combat and their senses are just overloaded
Yeah.
with all the trauma around them.
Yeah. Well, you know, the way that our nervous system responds is based off of the most basic parts of our brain. So we're talking about the reptilian and mammalian parts of our brain, or what's called the limbic system. And those parts are not our adult neocortex thinking brain. They are the parts of our brain that are scanning for danger 24/7 and ready to act in an instant to keep us safe. And I think it's important to recognize that danger is a subjective term, depending on who you are as a person. So, you know, again, an example would be, let's say you're walking down the street and you see a dog running towards you. One person might experience that as danger. Oh my God, this dog is going to attack me. And the next person goes, oh my God, there's a dog running down the street, gets down on its level and lets it lick its face. And so danger is subjective. And so the reptilian part of our brain is constantly scanning for what might feel threatening or dangerous. That's where like the nervous system is responding out of, is that part of our brain. It's not responding out of our adult part of our brain of like, oh yes, this is, you know, a dog that is much smaller than me and just got loose from its leash. No, we're just in survival mode at that point. I think you were talking about shell shock before that. That is kind of the first time that trauma appeared on the scene, that people were going, hey, there's something here. We're not really understanding it, but they thought it was just related to war. But their bodies, that reptilian part of their brain was running the show. It was not their thinking part of the brain. They were going, we are in a dangerous situation. This feels really familiar. I have to do whatever I need to keep myself alive. And in the case of a lot of shell shock cases, we're looking at that freeze response.
Just absolutely shut them down. Yeah. And at first
they
thought they put it down to cowardice and,
you
know, moral cowardice. And some of these guys were lined up against a wall and shot because they were, you know, deemed cowards. They were afraid to go back to the trenches.
Yeah.
So how does this relate to religious trauma? Because we were talking earlier about growing up evangelical and fundamentalist. So here I am at 10, 11, 12 years old. I'm freaking out because I'm concerned that I'm going to be left behind in the rapture after seeing A Thief in the Night, begging God, making sure that I'm definitely a Christian night after night after night, praying the sinner's prayer. I mean, that's got to be traumatic.
Yes.
How does that relate in your example too of the purity culture, obsessing about not even kissing and the appearance of evil? You're all this anxiety and you adding the religious piece now. How does that become religious trauma syndrome?
Yeah. So, you know, I think what's important, I'm going to deviate and then I'll come back. What's important to understand about trauma is I say trauma is subjective, perceptive, subconscious, and embodied. So what the short term or shorthand definitions for that, trauma is subjective. So like we've talked about, what is traumatic for you may or may not be for me and vice versa. Trauma is perceptive, meaning that it does not have to be a real thing that's happening, but it could be the perception that something is happening. So in your case, this perception that if I do this thing or don't say this prayer, hell is inevitable, even though we would say hell's not a real place. As a child, you don't know that. You're being taught that. You're you're terrified, right?
Absolutely.
So this
I was convinced.
This perceived punishment is now manifesting itself as fear and anxiety and terror, right, in your body.
Absolutely.
So trauma is perceptive. Trauma is subconscious, meaning that we don't, like we said, consciously think of, oh, this is dangerous, this is not dangerous. It's those early parts of our brain that are determining that, and then determining what the response is that we're going to have. And then trauma is embodied, meaning that it lives inside of our body. We don't think it away. We don't simply change our thoughts and beliefs because it's in our body, and so it's worked out of our body. So when we talk about then, what does that look like with growing up, you know, in a fundamentalist home or a religiously abusive home? We're talking about indoctrination, which I think is very close to brainwashing.
Yeah, it is. It's a mind control tactic.
Yep, uncritical thinking, you will believe this and you are not allowed to think critically about it. Not only that, we're not going to teach you how to think critically about it. So all you know is that here's what is right.
We're not going to expose you to other points of view.
Exactly.
Because like you, when you went to, ironically, your example of going to Liberty for your master's degree exposed you to other points of view. It was when I went to Bible college, that was the first time I had ever understood that there were even other sort of theological systems that differed from mine, that I was raised to believe.
Yeah.
That was the first time I said, wait a minute, there's multiple options here. I'm representing one of many possible paths or traditions. Mm-hmm. So that rocked my world just as an evangelical.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And so when you think about the way that our brains and bodies work together, the more that we hear a message, either consciously or unconsciously, if we're just kind of taking it in, or outright spoken versus implied and inferred, it creates neurological pathways in our brain that become that subconscious automatic thought and behavior. And so the most basic one we have is breathing. We don't think about, okay, take a breath and take another one and take another one. Like it is neurologically wired that our body just breathes, right? And so indoctrination, brainwashing can work the same way. The more that those messages get in, they become the automatic subconscious responses. And they are wired into our brain, which then sends chemicals down to our body to respond in very specific ways. So when we look at, okay, I'm getting out of this religious belief system, even like you were saying, I'm moving to expand my religious belief system. This is very different than what I've been taught. And it can feel rather frightening, right? Because I've been told A, B, and C. Now I realize that there's X, Y, and Z, and it's more than just shifting my beliefs over here. Like I have a physiological response to that. I might feel anxiety. I might feel guilt or shame that I didn't know this before. I might feel scared that I know something that maybe my parents don't know, and they're going to be really disappointed that I've shifted my beliefs over to something else that is different than what they believe. So we feel it in our body, even though we're like, oh, I'm going to just change my beliefs. It works out that way too. And then even on a greater scale, when we leave that religious system altogether, it's more than just saying, oh, I don't believe this, and I believe on this side of the spectrum, and I believe this on this side of the spectrum. Because every time then that, I shouldn't say every time, a lot of times then when we act out of this new set of beliefs or ways of living, our body's like, that's not right. I think a perfect example of that would be going back to purity culture. No sexual activity before marriage, including usually no masturbation, no self-pleasuring, no sexual thoughts, desires, anything. So let's say you say, no, I'm done with that. That's not a thing. I'm going to engage in sexual practices that I want to engage in. And you go to engage them, and all of a sudden there's a lot of dysfunction or sexual pain or a lot of guilt and shame or fear or disgust. And you go, well, that's weird because I gave up those beliefs, but my body is responding as if I'm still in that moment, right? So I think it's important that when we look at coming out of a religiously traumatic situation, we are not just shifting our thoughts, we're actually having to process what is it that my body and brain are believing together and responding, and I have to do work around that rather than just saying, no, like forget about that, I'm going to just push through and do this thing. We actually might be re-traumatizing ourselves because we're doing the thing that we've been taught is very dangerous and will put us in hell. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, how much of it relates to this issue of cognitive dissonance too? Because surely that's a part of what you're describing, this idea that if you're holding to two things that seem to be competing with each other, conflicting ideas, and you feel that dissonance, the unease that you were describing, some people will double down in an effort to defend their own pre-existing worldview. For example, I had a student when I was teaching at the Bible college up here in Liverpool, and this guy, his mission was to prove, in air quotes, that I, the teacher, was incorrect theologically, and that anytime another student said something that he disagreed with from his point of view, he had to go out of his way to correct their false, flawed, faulty belief system. And so it was a constant problem because he was always operating from within this very narrow fundamentalist viewpoint. And anything either I, that as a teacher or another student said, he would argue with to prove that his position was correct. He was sort of like a heresy policeman. That was his job, to point out anything that was wrong, incorrect, or whatever, according to his system. And I talked to him many times to try to get him to be a little more charitable. I knew I wasn't going to change his belief. There was no way. He was a fundamentalist.
Sure.
I just said, can't you accept the fact that there are other points of view? And you're here to be exposed to them and interact with them. And in that process, you might learn something and expand your horizon just a little bit. And he never did. He couldn't. So for him, doubling down and digging in was the only option, and correcting the flawed, false views of others, including mine as the teacher. So we had a lot of arguments.
I think what a great example of the fear of cognitive dissonance, right? So anytime that this particular student was challenged or a new idea was presented to them, I would say, I don't know them, I'm not in their body, but I would say they probably felt something internally that felt rather uncomfortable or frightening. And so rather than sitting in that and actually going, what is that? Why
maybe
do I
being
feel this
challenged.
discomfort? They go, I don't like the way that I feel. And so I'm going to do something that will shut that feeling off. And so for him, that was doubling down. Like, I will fight harder. I will yell louder.
Come out swinging.
Yes, absolutely.
Which he did many times. He was actually bullying the other students to the point where he was creating an unsafe environment for the other students, and they were then fearful to express their opinions or thoughts because they were like, oh, I'm not going to say anything because this guy is probably going to jump down my throat. Therefore, this is no longer a safe space to explore ideas. That then became my problem as the teacher. I'm trying to facilitate a safe space so we can explore new ideas, blah, blah, blah. And he's, obstructing that. So that's the other possibility, is to double down.
Exactly.
Which is where he was coming from. And he was actually a pastor. That's the best part of this whole story. We're talking about mature adults here. We're not talking about high school kids. These were adults in a Bible college setting getting their bachelor's degree. And he was married with a family, and he was a pastor of a church at that point.
Wow.
And I'm thinking, my God, what kind of a church was this guy running? I can only imagine.
Absolutely. Well, and when you think about that, as we're talking about kind of being indoctrinated for quite a long time, for anybody to ask him a question or to try to open up his horizon and just make a suggestion, what about this, right? Feels incredibly threatening to him because, like we said, trauma is real or perceived, like it can be perceived. So there is a fear response in him that if I were to open up my horizons and maybe look at something differently, it's not just that I'm changing a belief. It is that I'm opening myself up to hell, right?
The implications are huge.
Right. And
it's everything.
Yeah, on the
it's all or
outside,
nothing.
You go, no, that's not it at all. When you're in that trauma space of like, if I were to look at this one belief, I could end up in hell, then that really shifts the way that I'm going to behave when anything that comes up against my belief is said or done or questioned. And so they're coming from a very fear-based space because there's no room to grow or anything like that, because I literally am needing to keep myself alive eternally.
Yeah, these stakes are all important.
Yeah.
Well, and how much of this relates to this issue of triggering? Because obviously there's a couple of things here, isn't there? This person's being triggered by suggestions that I or other students might have been making. But I talked with Janice Selby. I've talked to Claudine Gallagher about triggering in other podcasts, where I personally or someone else hear something, you hear a worship song or something happens, and bam, you're right back in the shit, as it were, and you have that physiological response. Like you say, you feel something physical inside as well as mentally. How does triggering relate to all this talk of religious trauma?
Yeah, that's a great question. You did what you said right there, I think speaks so well to it. You know, this random thing happens that you have no control over, and then you have a physiological response. And it's so easy to get down on ourselves and to say, well, damn it, like this was 25 years ago. Why am I still dealing with that?
I should be over this by now.
Yeah. And
what's wrong with me?
Yeah, that invites a lot of shame. Anytime we're like, I should be over, anytime we should ourselves, that's shame right there. And so we get caught in that of, there's something wrong with me. I can't get over this. When in reality, the potential for triggers is going to happen our whole entire lives. Even the healthiest people are still going to sometimes be triggered by something. And that doesn't have to mean anything. But what it usually means is that this is just the place where I need to do a little bit of work around. And it might be as simple as having a little bit of an internal dialogue to remind myself that I'm right here, I'm right now, I'm in this moment. Or it might be that you go, gosh, this thing has been coming up a lot, and I might need to seek some outside support in the form of like a licensed professional that can use some modalities to like really help me through something like this. And there's a gamut of things in between. We're never going to be able to determine when we're triggered as human beings. It's just not possible. But we can have power over what do I want to do when those things happen. And so when we can look at that from that perspective of like, actually the trigger just shows me like my next step of healing, that actually seems to open up some space of like, oh, that actually means I'm growing. Because I didn't see this thing before, and now I do. And so this shows me where I can continue to take off kind of those old layers and continue moving into, the present moment and who I want to be.
Changing that life script, isn't it? It's changing the narrative.
The narrative.
This is something that discussion with Claudine really helped me out a lot in the podcast. And I said, this is turning into a therapy session for me. I'm supposed to be interviewing you here, Claudine. And suddenly we're spending the last 15, 20 minutes talking about my experiences feeling triggered. But she zeroed in on something really critical that helped me a lot. In fact, we had her on a Zoom call for our podcast group the other last month. And I said to her, Claudine, you really, really helped me out, because what I didn't see that I was doing was exactly what you said, was that when I was triggered, I was attaching all this negativity and anger and shame and loss. And I spent all these years in that system, and I was angry at myself, and it was bringing up, it was all uniformly negative. Yeah. And like you said, what she helped me to see was you can change that script, as it were, and turn it into a positive. As you say, that's something that I wouldn't have been triggered by maybe 5-10 years ago.
Right.
But now, okay, that's just an area where I need to do some work. And there's a lot of more positives around this than negatives, rather than it being a self-defeating, because I kept using the word blindsided. I was blindsided. I was blindsided. She said, if that's the way you're going to frame it, then you're always going to be blindsided, and it's debilitating. Yeah. That's very disempowering. That's not a good thing. You don't want to be blindsided every time you turn around.
Yeah. A trigger is actually fairly neutral when we think about it. So even that language, blindside, feels very powerful.
Yeah, that's not neutral.
Negative. When we can shift that narrative to a trigger just is a thing. It is what it is. It's not good or bad. It's just a thing. And I'm noticing how my physiology, my body is responding to that. Then I can attune to that and make a decision of what I need to do in that moment. That feels much more empowering. So, I had family in town this weekend, and which is massively triggering for me in multiple ways. And so I've done enough work that I know how to prepare my system for that. I know how to, take some breaks and say no. And, like those, I know where my limits are at.
Yeah, you have some tactics to deal with it.
But then I had a situation on Saturday morning where my mother didn't get the response that she wanted, and I knew it. And normally I would try to make that better so that I can soothe myself because, oh man, like I don't want to just
feeling it. Yeah.
And so instead I didn't. And I went I went for about a 4-mile walk. And I just had a dialogue with my body of like, okay, did we see what happened back there? We know that mom is now in your guest bedroom having a moment, and we know that that's not your fault and it's not your job to make her feel okay. She can ask for what she needs. She's an adult. She can come and have a conversation. And nurturing those younger parts of myself that felt really triggered, like I've just disappointed my mother. I've let her down. It's my job to make her happy. And that would have normally ruined my day, or at least a good chunk of my day. And instead, I just noticed what that trigger was and allowed myself to do what I needed to do and had a wonderful rest of the day. So I could have gotten really mad in that moment, like, oh, she did that thing again, and that just messes with me. And now I'm just off kilter and I'm on edge and I'm sharp and I'm all these sorts of things because I'm now in protection mode. And I've been there many times before.
Oh, yeah. So
right. But I've decided that's not worth it because that's only hurting me. And I want to do something different. So when those triggers come in from her, I'm going to nurture myself versus continue that narrative that has been ingrained for many years. So I'm creating a new narrative and a new neurological pathway that's happening.
You're not letting it destroy you or defeat you. Because I think, something that really changed my approach to teaching, because when I started at this new job, I had never taught 16 to 18-year-olds. They're basically high school students. And I would find myself sort of getting down in there and battling with them over petty little things. Yeah. And I went to my course manager and I said, look, I'm having a real hard time here. These guys are winding me up and somehow they're getting to me. I'm getting upset. Like you're saying, it's somehow it's work. And he said, what you got to understand is from their point of view, when you get upset, they've won.
Yeah.
They're laughing and they're pushing your buttons and you're allowing them to do that. You're playing right into their game. And when I saw that construct, it disempowered their sort of approach to what they were doing to me, like you said. So I think, okay, I don't think that way. I don't push people's buttons just to get a response, but that's what these guys do.
Yeah.
And so once you can kind of step back a little bit, zoom back from the actual situation and kind of start seeing it for what it is, that's a big step, isn't it? In terms of being triggered and, you could just have your whole day destroyed. Yeah. Your whole life could be nothing but stress and anxiety.
Yeah. And one of the things that I know for me, this is something I teach, I do with myself, I teach my clients, is when we zoom back, I try to go like, what is the part of me that's being triggered right now? Do I feel like I'm 14 again? And so like with my mother, I feel like a 14-year-old. I feel like she treats me like a 14-year-old. And so typically up until the last couple years or whatnot, when I've responded back to her, even though I've been in my 30s, mid to upper 30s, I'm responding as a 14-year-old and not my 35, 36, 37-year-old self. And so when we zoom back, when we go, okay, I'm triggered, to be able to give yourself a little bit of space to go, what is the part of me right now that's being triggered? Oh, it's this little boy who is terrified of this or that, or it's this little girl who feels like I'm being bullied all over again. And even though I cognitively know I'm an adult in this situation, I feel my body feels like it is back, 25 years ago. Right. And so that's where, we talk about like trauma responses and stuff. It's not so much this cognitive process of let's just think differently. It's going, no, my body feels very familiar. I feel like I did when I was 14. I feel like I did when I was back watching that movie for the very first time. So when we can go back and nurture that part of us, to imagine that, 6-year-old Clint is sitting right next to you, what would you have wanted what would 6-year-old Clint have needed in that moment that he never got? He probably needed to be told, hey, like, this isn't real. Like, let me cover your eyes for you. Let me plug your ears for you. And let me tell you that you are safe. And I'm going to actually pick you up and I'm going to take you out of here. And sometimes we need to actually give ourselves that like the actual physical, I'm going to kind of wrap my arms around, this hypothetical child, and I'm going to actually move that child out of this scene. And it's this idea of reparenting our inner child or inner children and giving that part of our nervous system the safety and the connection that it needed, that it never got. And when we're able to do that, it's not that we won't be triggered anymore. It's that we might feel that it's less intense, and we might feel like we have much more control over what that is. Because then when that trigger comes up again, you go, oh, hey, little 6-year-old Clint, I'm here. I've got it. What do you need right now to feel safe? And we can give that to ourselves.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be debilitating and crippling. And if those are the words, blindsided, crippling, debilitating, angering, whatever the negatives around that, we've got to be able to change that script, haven't we? And rewrite it, but we can do that. Well, what's your advice for someone who's going through this? I mean, I think part of this is just realizing, my God, I've been traumatized as a kid, as an adult, growing up in religion or in a cult or something like that. They've suffered abuses of all sorts. What does a person do? Is the best thing to find someone like you, seek therapy, counseling?
Yeah. So just like we talked about, trauma is subjective, so is healing. So what people need is going to be different depending on who they are. What people need can be different depending on what season or stage of life they're at also. It's not uncommon after you get out of an adversive religious experience, whether that be abuse or harm or whatnot, to go, I need space from that. I need to get away. I need to learn about different things. I need to deconstruct. I need to figure out who I am. That's part of the healing process. And for a season of life, that might be it. That might be all you can handle. And that's fine. For some people, they truly are like, you know what? I really wasn't that deeply affected. And so literally switching my thoughts and beliefs, that works.
That's enough.
I would say great. But I think there's a great many other people, especially those of us who were indoctrinated from literally the time that we were born. There's never a time that we didn't know like what it was like to be indoctrinated until as an adult we came out. We go, there's probably going to be some deeper work that may need to happen in terms of really processing trauma from a body or what's called somatic base level. And I am a big believer that there is no one perfect therapeutic modality. There's no one way. It's very different for everybody. But, in terms of like a step-by-step process, I think therapy can be a really wonderful thing. I think if you find a therapist who is trained in the trauma modalities, something like EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or internal family systems, somatic experiences that really help you tune back into your body and is able to help you rewire your brain. So reprocess things and then rewire your brain in order to be able to feel safe and connected. I would say I would always be a proponent of those modalities over anything like cognitive behavioral or, switch your thoughts, switch your behaviors, solution focus.
It's just that easy.
Yeah, exactly.
A lot of work needs to be done.
Just change that. Yeah. So I know that's not like necessarily like a specific answer to like, how does this actually look? But I think it's going to look different. I think the biggest thing though is finding people that you feel safe with, that will honor your experience, that will not try to shame you for what's happened, that will not try to tell you that this is how you should think or you shouldn't think, or tell you to just get over it like you just had a bad church experience. You want to find somebody who is trained but can hold that space for you to go like, it is okay to ask questions and to throw everything out, or to throw nothing out, or to cry, or to feel, or whatever it might be, that you would feel safe with them to hold that they would hold that space.
You got to be able to process through it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think
in a safe space.
Yeah, that over anything is the most important, because there are some really great resources out there. There's some really great podcasts and books and social media accounts and everything that can be very helpful, but your work has to be your work. And so it has to look specific to you. And you know, I know for myself, I went through a period of time where I did need space. I needed to just kind of throw it all out and say, I'm not even going to think about this. I just know that like I am going to do things differently. And then I had another season where I had to work through that, because it was not working well to just throw it out and have nothing in its place, right?
You got to replace it with something, hopefully a positive thing.
Yes.
I was going to say what John Atack said in one of our podcasts, you know, that there's a couple steps he recommended: getting the rest you need, getting the nutrition you need once you've left religion, not spending all your time obsessing about the cult or the religion that you came out of. But then finding things that you enjoy to do. Absolutely. In my case, it's playing the drums or getting tattoos or, you know, whatever it is. These are things that I enjoy to do, and they are therapeutic. Building something. I like to build furniture. You know, these are things I could spend hours in the workshop building things and get in the zone and the flow. And that does something, you know, I don't know what it is, but it's helpful.
You know, I think too, especially when you're talking about people that have been indoctrinated since birth, like there was never that normal time of differentiation. And that just means like figuring out, who am I apart from my system that I grew up in? And so there's a great many people who are 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years old that are coming out of this that are like, I have no idea who I am. I don't even know my favorite color. You know, because I've lived being told who I am and what I should think and what I should like, how I should
religious identity. That's the only one we've got, is the religious identity.
Exactly.
That's who I was.
Yeah. So I think those activities, like you said, it's like, you know, I tell my clients sometimes, go to a bookstore and just walk through and see what books like your eyes are drawn to.
Yeah,
and
what piques your interest?
The color, or because of the photography or the subject, like it doesn't matter. You know, go to a coffee shop, you know, 7 days in a row and order a different drink every single time and see what you like. And or do that at a restaurant. And just, it sounds so simple, but we're going, if you've never had the ability to make a choice based off of you yourself, something that like,
simple,
that's a big deal.
That's pretty huge. Yeah.
And say like, I want my eggs made this way. And
not the way I've had it every day for the last 40 years. There's only one way to make an egg, and that's it, you know?
Yeah. So, you know, I think one thing that's important to realize too, is that when we are coming out of a system like this, it is so tempting to kind of fall back into other systems or groups of people or relationships that mirror that and replicate the same trauma. But if you have a spectrum and you're at one side of the spectrum with fundamentalism, where we are taught what to think, not how to think, everything's decided for us. Our natural inclination is to swing to the other side of the spectrum, because we just go, I have to do things opposite of how I did do them. But the problem is that either side of the spectrum never requires us to think, because we're either on one side, we're being told what to think, and on the other side, we're doing the opposite of that.
We don't have to think. Yeah.
Right.
The pendulum is swung to the other extreme.
Right. And so
that's not necessarily healthy either.
Exactly. And so part of the healing process, a big part of it, is finding what the balance is, but that is what takes time, work, energy, intention, all of those sorts of things. And so it can be also really easy when we come out of that to attach ourselves to people and systems that are just as fundamental or just as abusive, because it feels really unsafe to think for ourselves and to be making choices. And so I've seen that happen a lot on social media with big voices that people will kind of attach themselves to because they go, oh, that kind of sounds right. And you've been out of this longer than I have. And so that must be right. So rather than actually thinking about what is it about this person or group or whatever, I'm going to just kind of attach myself to it. And that can actually become quite toxic because now I've created another authority in my life that is not myself, or I've created a system where I'm the authority in other people's lives and I tell them what to do.
So you're just replicating the original dynamic that got us in the shit in the first place.
Yes. And so I would be very weary of any belief system, relational system, whether that's individual or a group or whatnot, that says this is the way that you're supposed to think, act, do, whatever. Just join us, reject all of this and do it this way. I would say, I don't know that as humans, that's what we should do anyways. Like our goal shouldn't be to have minions of each other, right? We're individuals, we are unique. And so part of our journey is to figure out, who am I as an individual? It's not to just align with groupthink. It's not, that feels safer.
Seems to be human nature though, doesn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
We seem to have that tendency to sort of fall into groupthink. Well, I don't want to keep you too long. We've been having a fantastic discussion. I mean, I could keep talking to you for hours. How can people get a hold of you if they said, okay, I want to get a hold of Laura? What resources can you recommend and all that? What's the best way to contact you?
Yeah, so I have a website. It's just lauraandersontherapy.com. I've got a ton of resources on there, books, podcasts, that sort of thing that people can check out. And then I have it linked, over to Amazon or whatnot. There's a contact form that you can reach me at if that is of interest to you. I do a lot of, I obviously work with religious trauma a lot. So I take on clients that are dealing with that. I also do a lot of consulting with mental health professionals on religious trauma. So that could look like, helping them work through specific client cases, teaching them different things, getting them educated. I'm a big believer that the client shouldn't have to educate the therapist entirely. So I try to provide that. Also, I don't know when this podcast is going to air, but probably close to the time that this is airing, I've created a manual on religious trauma that is specifically for mental health providers, but anybody can read it. And I'm happy to give your listeners a code so that they can get a discount on that, or they can tell their therapist to go and get it. And here's a discount.
That'd be great.
But it goes through a lot of different dynamics of religious trauma and treating it and that sort of thing. And then I'm also on social media, and I'm on Instagram and Twitter, and my handle is at ms_L Anderson, ELLE Anderson. And I do a lot of education on trauma. I interact with people about religious trauma in general, how to understand it. What does that look like in your body? So that's the best way to reach me. That's kind of what I do. I'm also working with some really amazing therapists throughout the country. We are kind of together, like working on putting together resources for therapists. So the Reclamation Collective, which is out of Minneapolis, that's Kendra Snyder and Kayla Felton. And they have a list that will be out soon that you can access that has a variety of different therapists from all over the nation that are trained in religious trauma. And then Brian Peck, who is Room to Thrive, he does a lot on social media as well and sees religious trauma clients. He lives in Boise, Idaho, and sees a lot of ex-Mormon clients given his location. But the four of us work together a lot and are kind of trying to put more resources out there for mental health clinicians specifically. So they're really
great to hear that. I mean, that you're so passionate about this topic and that it's becoming more and more discussed, isn't it? It's actually a thing. It's something that people like me, like you, so many other people. I know, of course, Janice is doing that conference on religious trauma in Vancouver, BC in April of 2020. She's got a load of great speakers lined up for that as well. So yeah, it's becoming more and more readily discussed. And so it sounds like the best way to do it is to get a hold of you.
Yeah.
If nothing else, they can Skype with you, they can Zoom with you, or get in touch with you on social media.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If you want what do they call it? Insta therapy, follow me on social media.
That's the way
I don't
forward.
do therapy over social media, but that'll give you the little nuggets. But
yeah, you can get a hold of Laura that way.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. This has been absolutely fascinating. I mean, I could talk for another 2 hours, but
yeah, I get it.
thank you. Also, you're going to be dropping into our Zoom call.
Yes.
I'm really excited to get our group of people together to meet you and to talk to you face to face, and we can really dig our teeth into the subject of religious trauma or whatever else comes up in the group.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm excited to do that. It'll be really fun.
All right. Thank you so much, Laura, for being such a great guest. I will see you in some point for our Zoom call.
Yes, sounds
with the
wonderful.
group. Okay. Thank you, Laura.
Bye.
And as a matter of fact, we did indeed have that Zoom call, our monthly Mind Shift podcast Zoom call on the 27th of October with Laura Anderson, and some from our group, some of our Patreon supporters dropped into the call, and we had a fantastic discussion. Now, if you want to see that call, if you've been intrigued by what Laura and I were talking about, you can. That video will be posted up on Patreon in November. So if you want to take a look at that and see more about what we talked about RTS, we talked about triggering, some very specific things that some of the people brought up within the call. That is going to be on Patreon, as well as the other calls. This is a great benefit for you supporting Mind Shift Podcast. I've actually added a couple of tiers on there. If you want to support me at a $5 or $10 a month level, I'll send you some really cool gifts. So take a look at patreon.com/Mind Shift Podcast if you want to find out more about the many rewards and benefits you get from being a Patreon supporter of this show. Oh, and speaking of benefits, I want to mention really quickly, if you recall, Laura talked about a resource that she has available on her website. It's a manual that she's created. What I'll do is I'll put a link in the show notes to that resource, and I'm also going to give you that promo code. So take a look in the show notes if you're interested in that resource, which is available on Laura's website. Now, I know this has been a long episode. I'm going to let you go. I just want to mention that the next episode coming up in 2 weeks features a chat with Dave Warnock of Dying Out Loud. This is an amazing conversation, and I've got a bunch of people that I'm going to be talking to in the next couple of weeks. So I've got a whole slew of fantastic guests lined up. So there's some great content heading your way. So stay tuned for that. Come back in a couple of weeks and catch myself along with Dave Warnock. If you do me a favor too, leave me a 5-star review on iTunes or Podbean or Stitcher, whatever platform you listen to this show. That would be greatly helpful. If you can't afford to support me on Patreon, at least do me a favor of leaving me a review on whatever platform you listen to this show. So thanks again for listening in with myself and Laura. I'll catch you in a couple weeks with myself and Dave Warnock. You take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you in a bit. Bye-bye.